Wearable tech like the Oura Ring or Garmin was built to tell athletes how hard they can push, but it is quietly becoming a lifeline for people with adrenal insufficiency. When your body cannot produce its own stress hormones, a simple flight of stairs can look to your nervous system like a lion attack. We treat this condition with a static dose of medication, but life is not static. So, what happens when a patient can finally see the invisible crashes coming?
It completely changes the reality of living with the disease. Actually, no, it does not change the disease itself, but it changes the relationship a patient has with their own unpredictability. For someone with adrenal insufficiency, whether that is Addison's disease or secondary adrenal insufficiency, they are living in a body that has lost its automatic transmission. They have to manually shift gears for every stressor. And until recently, they had to do that completely blind. The introduction of continuous data from wearables is giving them a dashboard for the first time.
That manual transmission analogy is perfect, but let's clarify what we are actually talking about here. The recent piece from My Adrenal Life points out that these devices are not measuring cortisol directly. They are measuring the downstream wreckage when cortisol is missing.
Exactly. We are not there yet with continuous cortisol monitors, though I know there is research happening. Studies like the Ultradian trial out of Europe are looking at high-frequency cortisol measurement, but for the everyday patient right now, a smartwatch cannot tell you your cortisol is at 4 micrograms per deciliter. What it can tell you is that your resting heart rate is 10 beats higher than normal, your skin temperature is up, and your heart rate variability, HRV, has plummeted. It shows the physiological echo of a system under strain.
It is tracking the strain, not the hormone.
Right. And for a medical team trying to figure out why a patient keeps ending up in the ER with an adrenal crisis, or why they feel like they have the flu every afternoon, that downstream data is a goldmine. Because the alternative is just the patient saying, "I feel bad." And "I feel bad" does not usually get you a change in your treatment plan.
Which brings us to the trap of standard activity tracking. For a long time, the only health metric everyday people cared about was the 10,000 steps.
Oh, the steps. The 10,000 steps goal is essentially useless and sometimes actively harmful for someone with a chronic illness characterized by limited physiologic reserve. If you have adrenal insufficiency, your problem is not usually a lack of motivation to move. Your problem is that your body cannot recover from the movement. So an Apple Watch buzzing to tell you to stand up or close your rings is missing the fundamental issue.
It is optimizing for output when the system is failing at recovery.
That is a great way to put it. We live in a fitness culture that worships output. Calories burned, minutes in the red zone, miles run. But if you have Addison's disease, your body is fundamentally altered in how it manages the aftermath of output. Cortisol is the hormone that helps you recover. It manages inflammation, stabilizes blood sugar, and regulates blood pressure after a stressor. When you don't make it, or when your pituitary doesn't send the signal to make it, that recovery phase is broken.
Let's dig into that HPA axis connection, the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis. This is the command center that is supposed to handle all of this automatically.
Right. The HPA axis is essentially the body's risk management department. Under normal circumstances, you encounter a stressor, say a hard workout, a stressful meeting, or catching a virus. The hypothalamus senses the stress, tells the pituitary to send out ACTH, which tells the adrenal glands to pump out cortisol. Cortisol then floods the system to give you the glucose you need for energy, tamps down the immune system so you don't overinflame, and essentially keeps the ship steady while you deal with the crisis.
And in adrenal insufficiency, that chain is broken.
Broken or severely impaired. In primary adrenal insufficiency, the adrenals themselves are damaged, usually by an autoimmune attack. In secondary or tertiary, the signaling from the brain is blunted or absent, but the end result is the same. The ship hits a storm and no one is at the wheel adjusting the ballast. The patient has to take oral hydrocortisone or another steroid to mimic that response. But a pill you take at 7 a.m. cannot anticipate the stressful email you get at 2 p.m.
Wait, does that actually hold? Because endocrinologists often say that a standard replacement dose covers normal daily living. If a patient is on a physiologic dose of hydrocortisone, shouldn't that baseline keep them stable for minor stressors like an email or a walk?
I hear you, but I keep getting stuck on the word normal. What is normal daily living? A baseline dose is designed to mimic a healthy person's basal cortisol production, but a healthy person's cortisol isn't a flat line. It is highly pulsatile. It rises and falls dynamically in response to tiny metabolic demands throughout the day. When a patient takes a pill, it peaks in their blood about an hour later and then steadily drops off. It is a crude imitation of a highly sophisticated biological rhythm. So yes, they have cortisol in their system, but it is not responding to real-time demand.
So the baseline dose is a safety net, not a thermostat.
Exactly. It keeps you alive, but it doesn't give you the adaptability of a thermostat. And this is where the autonomic nervous system comes in. The HPA axis doesn't operate in a vacuum. It works intimately with the autonomic nervous system, the sympathetic, which is your fight or flight, and the parasympathetic, which is your rest and digest. Cortisol is supposed to help transition the body between those two states. It is the buffer.
Without the buffer, the nervous system gets stuck.
It gets stuck or it overreacts. You see this constantly in chronic illness communities, not just adrenal insufficiency, but long COVID, ME/CFS, dysautonomia. The sympathetic nervous system gets triggered by a minor event, standing up too fast, digesting a heavy meal, taking a shower, and because the cortisol response isn't there to appropriately manage the physiological demand, the sympathetic system just revs higher and higher. The heart rate spikes. The blood pressure might drop or become erratic.
Which brings us to heart rate variability, HRV. This is the metric everyone with a wearable is suddenly obsessed with, but it is notoriously misunderstood.
It really is. People think HRV is just your heart rate, but it is actually the variance in time between your heartbeats. If your heart rate is 60 beats per minute, it doesn't mean your heart beats exactly once every second. Sometimes it's 0.9 seconds, sometimes 1.1 seconds. That variability is driven by the competing signals of your sympathetic and parasympathetic nervous systems. When your parasympathetic system, specifically the vagus nerve, is highly active and keeping you relaxed, your HRV is high. There's a lot of variability. It means you are adaptable.
And when you are under stress, the sympathetic system takes over, the heart beats like a metronome, and HRV drops.
Right. A low HRV means your body is essentially in a state of high alert, pouring all its resources into survival mode, which leaves very little flexibility to handle new stressors. For an adrenal insufficiency patient, HRV is a profound window into their physiologic reserve. Because they lack dynamic cortisol, their body relies heavily on adrenaline and noradrenaline, the sympathetic drivers, to get through the day. The result is often a chronically suppressed HRV.
According to research published in the journal Circulation, HRV is a reliable gauge of autonomic nervous system function. Studies are increasingly showing that chronic illnesses drastically alter these recovery patterns. But doctors don't typically look at HRV.
No, they don't. And that is the massive disconnect in clinical care right now. A patient goes to their endocrinologist twice a year. The doctor pulls a metabolic panel, maybe checks an ACTH level, looks at their electrolytes, and takes their blood pressure while they are sitting calmly in a chair. Those are snapshots, single time point measurements. If the sodium and potassium look fine at 10 a.m. on a Tuesday, the doctor says, your replacement dose is adequate. See you in 6 months.
But the patient is saying they're crashing every afternoon at 3 p.m.
Exactly. The clinical snapshot misses the hour-to-hour reality. It misses the post-exertional response. It misses the fact that the patient's heart rate shoots up to 130 just from doing laundry, or that their sleep is incredibly fragmented, or that their HRV has been tanking for 3 days before they finally developed a low-grade fever. Wearables provide continuous physiologic data. They reveal the trends that the snapshots obscure.
I don't know, that feels too clean to me. You are talking about continuous data as this objective truth, but doctors are incredibly skeptical of patient-generated wearable data, and often for good reason. A Garmin or an Oura Ring is not a medical device. They are consumer gadgets prone to artifacts, bad sensor placement, and proprietary algorithms.
You are absolutely right to point that out, and doctors are justified in their skepticism when a patient dumps a spreadsheet of raw Apple Watch data on their desk. But the value isn't in absolute diagnostic precision. The value is in pattern recognition. A 2024 study in PMC on continuous monitoring highlighted that wearable sensors provide an opportunity for personalized detection of health changes relative to an individual's baseline. It is not about whether the Oura Ring's absolute HRV number is identical to an EKG. It is about the deviation. If a patient's normal baseline HRV is 35 and suddenly it drops to 15 for 3 days straight while their resting heart rate climbs by 10 beats, that is a physiological signal. It means the system is under acute strain.
It is a smoke alarm, not a thermometer.
Yes, and for patients who have symptoms that are incredibly difficult to articulate, like brain fog, heavy limbs, or that profound cellular fatigue that comes before an adrenal crisis, having that smoke alarm is validating. It gives them a language to use with their medical team. Instead of saying, "I feel tired," they can say, "My objective physiologic recovery metrics have plummeted over the last 48 hours, my resting heart rate is elevated, and I suspect my body is fighting an infection that requires me to stress dose my steroids."
Let's talk about the specific devices, because the My Adrenal Life article mentions a few, and they all have different philosophies. Whoop, Oura, Garmin, Apple Watch.
They do, and picking one really depends on what kind of data you can tolerate. The Oura Ring is heavily focused on sleep and overnight recovery. It measures your HRV and resting heart rate while you sleep, which is arguably the most accurate time to measure it because you remove the artifacts of movement and digestion. It gives you a readiness score in the morning. For many chronic illness patients, this is great because it helps them decide how much energy they can safely spend that day.
And Garmin takes a slightly different approach with the body battery feature.
The Garmin body battery is fascinating. It uses real-time HRV and heart rate data to estimate your energy reserve throughout the day on a scale of 0 to 100. It actually shows your battery draining when you are active or stressed and recharging when you rest. I have heard from so many patients with adrenal insufficiency and dysautonomia that this feature is revolutionary for pacing. They can literally see that a seemingly minor task, like a heated conversation, drained their battery by 15 points, so they know they need to lie down before they hit 0.
That visual feedback loop makes the invisible visible, but it also introduces the reality of the delayed crash. This is something that plagues the AI community. You do something strenuous on Saturday, you feel fine, and on Monday you can't get out of bed.
The delayed crash is one of the most frustrating aspects of HPA axis dysfunction. When a healthy person exercises, their cortisol spikes to meet the demand and then smoothly returns to baseline. When someone with AI exercises, their body might rely on adrenaline to get through the event. Adrenaline feels great in the moment. You feel energized, clear-headed, but adrenaline is a short-term loan. Eventually, the bill comes due, and without the cortisol to manage the tissue repair and the inflammation that follows, the body hits a wall hours or even days later.
And a wearable can catch that silent accumulation of strain.
Exactly. You might feel fine on Sunday, but your Oura Ring will show that your resting heart rate never dropped overnight. Your body temperature is slightly elevated, and your HRV is tanked. The sympathetic nervous system is still screaming. The wearable tells you the crash is coming before you feel it, which means you have a window to intervene, maybe by resting aggressively, hydrating, or discussing a temporary medication updose with your doctor.
Which introduces a heavy emotional element to all this data. Knowing the crash is coming can be a tool, but it can also be a source of profound anxiety.
It really can. There's a phenomenon called orthosomnia, where people become so obsessed with the data from their sleep trackers that the anxiety of trying to get a good score actually ruins their sleep. For a chronic illness patient, waking up and seeing a low recovery score can create a nocebo effect. You see the bad numbers, your anxiety spikes, your sympathetic nervous system kicks in, and you actually make yourself feel worse just by looking at the app.
Sometimes the healthiest thing you can do with a wearable is take it off.
Absolutely. Some people find that stepping away from constant data feels better. They use the wearable for a few months to learn their patterns, to understand that yes, vacuuming really does take a massive toll, or yes, staying up past 11 p.m. ruins their recovery for 2 days. Once they learn the pattern, they take the watch off and trust their somatic awareness. They trust their body.
But for the patients who have spent years being gaslit by doctors, who tell them their labs are normal and their fatigue is just anxiety, that data is armor.
It is. When so much of your illness is invisible, having a digital record that says, "No, my physiology is objectively struggling right now," is incredibly powerful. It changes the dynamic in the doctor's office. You aren't just an anxious patient complaining about fatigue. You are a patient presenting longitudinal data showing severe autonomic instability following physical exertion. That demands a different level of clinical respect.
The body isn't random. Even when it feels completely unpredictable, there are mechanisms failing or struggling beneath the surface. Wearables just pull back the curtain on the machinery.
They do. They don't diagnose and they don't cure, but they map the territory. And when you have a condition like adrenal insufficiency, where the terrain can shift underneath your feet without warning, having a map is the difference between constant fear and actual management. You are still the expert in how your body feels, but the data can validate that expertise.
We're still in the early days of figuring out how to integrate this kind of continuous monitoring into standard endocrinology, but the patient community is already leading the way. If you want to dive deeper into this topic and see the full articles, head over to the My Adrenal Life Facebook group. It is a fantastic community of patients and caregivers sharing what actually works for them. Join the conversation and let others know what patterns you are seeing in your own data.